Good morning, everyone. Oh, is that working? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the TimesTalks 20th Anniversary Festival. I'm Michelle Gray, the creative director of the New York Times live conversation, screening, performance series TimesTalks. For 20 years, TimesTalks has showcased world-class journalists and creative thought leaders who have used the arts, sciences, and public office as a lens for change and a platform for conversation. Throughout this weekend, TimesTalks will convene the brightest and boldest and most seminal voices for a series of substantive conversations and entertaining experiences. There's more in store following today's TimesTalks. Grab a cup of coffee at Bluestone Lane and visit the Smorgasbord food hall downstairs. Browse a specially curated selection of books and New York Times merchandise at the Strand pop-up bookstore, and explore the Absolute Art TimesTalks 20th Anniversary Collection. And after that, take a well-earned break at the Design Within Reach Lounge and sink into Molly Finlay's Mr. and Mrs. Noodle Lounge. Now down to business. I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's event with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Katie Couric and prize-winning investigative reporter Megan Twohey. In Couric's upcoming series, America Inside Out, she travels to dozens of cities across North America to get a look at the pressing social issues of our time, including gender inequality, Muslims in America, political correctness, white working class anxiety, and how technology is affecting our humanity. Moderating today's conversation is Megan Twohey, a prize-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times, who has focused much of her attention on the treatment of women and children. In 2017, she and Jodi Kantor broke the story of Harvey Weinstein's decades of alleged abuse towards women, helping to ignite the worldwide Me Too movement. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Megan Twohey and Katie Couric.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here, especially on such a beautiful day. We're so glad to have you with us. And Katie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming. I'm sure you want to be in the park right now. I was like, is anybody going to come to this? So thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to be here with you, and I want to talk to you today about the state of our country and also the state of the news. And I know you've been a member of the press for decades. As a reporter, anchor, and host, you've helped deliver news to millions of Americans. And I'm curious, when you first started out, how did you perceive the news consuming public? Did you see sharp divisions in how Americans got their news, say in the 90s?
Well, not really. I mean, I graduated from college, Megan, in 1979. So I started in the business in 1980. And of course, it was dramatically different. Back then, there were fewer outlets. I think there was a great deal of respect. I think it was post-Watergate. So I think people saw journalism as a really noble, important profession. I still believe it is critically important now more than ever. And but I think that the places from which you got news and information were quite limited. You know, 3 networks. It predated cable news, although I worked at CNN in the early 80s when everyone called it chicken noodle news before they had even really, become a thing. And so in the nascent days of my career, I did not see these sharp divisions. Of course, there were people who had different political views, and my dad would talk about John Birchers and things like that. My dad was kind of a Blue Dog Democrat. He was in journalism. He wrote for the Atlanta Constitution and United Press before it became UPI, covering politics, Lester Maddox and people like that in the South, and during the Civil Rights Movement. So, I was cognizant of people having different perspectives and Rockefeller Republicans and all that, but it certainly was not as polarized as it is today.
Right, and obviously, America today is so polarized, and the left and the right seem to exist in these separate news bubbles. Each side accuses the other of fake news.
Right.
And, when and how did that happen?
Well, I think there's been a slow erosion of trust in major institutions for a few years now, whether it's financial institutions as a result of the financial crisis. I think people have sort of just lost faith in some of these institutions that have guided us for a long time. And I think obviously Donald Trump has taken a shaker of Morton salt and just poured it into those fissures, and it's now kind of ignited and I don't want to use the term pus because it's too disgusting, but it's just so toxic and insidious. And I think one of the things he's very effective at is using these mantras, and then it's like a little drop of poison in this big barrel of water, and then other people start repeating the mantra, and then it starts to infect the entire well. And journalism as a profession, as a result, has been, I think, tarnished by this unfair moniker, in my view. Yeah. But not always unfair, because I think with the proliferation of various outlets, it is hard, I think, for the average consumer to discern what is real news and what is not real news. And the level of, I think, care it varies widely from outlet to outlet, obviously. But I think suddenly on your telephone, there's so many different things. I was joking the other day that I keep getting a notification that Joy Behar has died, and if I want to read her last words. And then I realized it's just a way to get you to go to a website to buy a skincare cream or something. And all these kind of tricks and the way I think that's also contributing to an erosion of trust in information writ large. Mm.
And so for your new series with National Geographic, America Inside Out, I've seen the episodes on the battle over the Confederate monuments and the experience of Muslims in America. And I know that there are more to come on white anxiety and the effects of technology. In fact, I think we'd like to play a trailer for the series now before continuing our talk.
The American landscape is shifting before our eyes.
Race it to the top, Mike.
Big changes.
Hi, Henry.
Hi, Katie.
Big challenges.
I hate to admit it, but I probably am prejudiced.
In a world that's more complicated than ever.
How many of you have been chipped? That kind of creeps me out. Would you consider yourself a neo-Nazi?
I would not. I would consider myself a white nationalist, and I would consider myself a member of the alt-right.
We're teaching kids that girls are second-class citizens.
HR has become HER.
Do you think this was a hate crime?
Without a doubt. She died because of her hijab.
American Muslims are shaped by American culture.
Tech addiction. There are a lot of positives, but there's some negative too.
I want to be your best friend and much more.
Maybe not the much more part, but the friends part, I'm cool with that.
It seems that everyone has something to say. But nobody's really listening.
What about my rights? Don't I have rights?
Join me on a journey as I crisscross the country, meeting all kinds of Americans where they live, work, pray, and play. Who are we? What do we stand for?
We're trying to get paid what white women get paid.
Where are we going? And how do we make things better?
Right there. This is Zainab. She's running for city council. Hey, how are you?
Searching for truth.
I actually think you're part of the cleaning crew.
Yes. Looking for understanding.
How would you describe what it's like to be Muslim?
Hard.
Hard?
Getting to the heart of the matter.
To have such conversations, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable.
In America Inside Out.
So you've clearly covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I'm exhausted. I really am.
So in your travels, I'm just curious, for all that ground you covered, what surprised you most during your journeys and why?
Gosh, I mean, I learned so much. It was really like writing 6 thesis papers on these various topics. You know, gosh, a lot surprised me. I think one thing is that how little journalists are actually going into the heart of the country these days. That there are a lot of talking heads, thank you, that there are, and I think that part of that inability to sort of be one-on-one and talk to people, and more importantly, listen to them, I think people just want to be heard. They want to be able to express themselves. They want to feel that their opinions and their life experiences and perspectives are being honored in some ways instead of attacked and trashed. And so I learned that I still have a lot to learn, and that that we are polarized, but I think the media feeds on that polarization because outrage is profitable, and compromise and conversation and really hearing each other and taking the time to get a different point of view and maybe understand that there's maybe a little truth on both sides. It's just not really, I don't think there are enough places for that in today's media landscape. So, every hour, Megan, I learned a tremendous amount. I didn't realize, for example, that most Confederate monuments were put up at the height of the Jim Crow South, or most of the public schools named after Confederate figures were done so after Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s. And
what's the significance of that?
Well, obviously, they're much more than just honoring Confederate heroes, quote unquote heroes. They were as an affront to the strides being made by African Americans in this country. And I think that's a really important factor when you're looking at the memorial landscape and forming an opinion. I think right now people just have opinions without portfolio. I think they lash out, they are kind of in their own silos, they're getting affirmation instead of information, so they're not getting different points of view. So that's really why I wanted to do this series. I wanted to hear, I wanted to understand, I wanted to take a step back and say, what do all these changes mean? I wanted to name the series Revolutions because I think we are going through so many seismic shifts in our society, and nobody, I think, is taking time to really consider these things and figure out what they mean and how we do work together as a country and what our shared values are, and how we can, without sounding too Pollyanna-ish, how can we focus on those and move forward instead of backwards. And it's very difficult in the current political climate, I understand, to do that, but I think one of the reassuring things I learned, it wasn't so much surprising as reassuring, is this grassroots movement of fair-minded people who really want this country to do better and be better.
So when you're talking about the history of the Confederate monuments, it really provides a very clear explanation for why people oppose these monuments.
Right.
When you were out there doing your reporting, what did you find as the reasons for people being so attached, for the other people being so attached to these monuments?
I think, the lost cause narrative and historical memory versus history itself, factual history, is incredibly hard to shake. This whole idea of Southern pride and heritage. And I think it takes a while to process and to walk in someone else's shoes and understand why some of these monuments and memorials, 1,500 Confederate symbols in public spaces across the country, 650 Confederate monuments, often put on these enormous pedestals. And these are public spaces which, in my opinion, announce to the community your values and what you stand for. So I think that it's just been deeply ingrained from the way we're taught about the Civil War, from the way we're not taught about the era of lynching, the Jim Crow South, and slavery properly, the way our textbooks position things. My daughters went to high school here in New York City, and they learned history from a Howard Zinn textbook, which is a totally different way I learned history when I was growing up in Arlington, Virginia. So I think that and as Gary Gallagher, who's a professor at UVA, where I went to college, said, he's an esteemed Civil War historian, he talks about the lost cause narrative and, that Gone with the Wind has done more to shape our views about the Civil War than anything he and other historians have taught for decades. So I think it's, just very much inculcated into our consciousness. And I think, it's hard to shake.
Yeah. And your reporting on this particular issue, the Confederate monuments, took you to Charlottesville you were there during the alt-right rally that turned
alt-right,
the alt-right rally
we
that,
usually
that
call
turned
them
violent.
white supremacists and neo-Nazis, but yes.
And it's, I mean, the news cycles are so insane these days that you almost I found myself forgetting about that.
Exactly.
And can you, I mean, as somebody who was there, how has that stayed with you?
Well, your first point, Megan, is so true. I think that it's so ferociously nonstop and there's so much information coming at us so fast and furiously. That's my point, that we didn't have a moment to step back and say, oh my God, what does this mean? And to really go even a couple of inches deeper. So I was there to talk about the controversy over the Robert E. Lee statue, which is in the center of Charlottesville. And I learned the backstory of that was a 16-year-old high school student named Ziona Bryant had actually started a petition to have the city council consider whether that statue should stay. And so I went there, and my producer, Malia Patria, had been kind of tracking this rally that was being planned. And we got there on, I think, a Thursday to do some interviews with Gary Gallagher and Ziona and some other people in the community, Frank Ernest from the Sons of the Confederacy, to talk about sort of his views of Robert E. Lee, which were very positive. And so we thought, well, we'll just stick around because who knows what's going to happen with this rally. The KKK had staged another rally in June, and it had turned out to be the protesters against it were much smaller than the people who were holding the rally itself. So we stuck around, and it was really, I mean, it was a very terrifying day. I'm not going to lie about that. It was, I've never seen so many people with so many symbols of hate, all different iterations of kind of these supremacy groups and young people. What was, I think, one of the most upsetting things, especially the torch rally on the grounds of the University of Virginia, where all these kids looked young and clean cut in their 20s, wearing white polo shirts and khakis, like the kids when I was at UVA, what a lot of kids wore and maybe still do, because it was kind of a preppy place. And it was really, really terrifying. And all the semi-automatic weapons that were strapped on people's backs and these militia groups that were wearing, camouflage, I thought it was just really remarkable that more people weren't hurt. And of course, Heather Heyer was killed when that car plowed into that group of people after the whole protest had kind of dissipated and they'd gone elsewhere. But it was really upsetting, but yet it was also very inspiring to see the fair-minded people of Charlottesville gather for an interfaith service. We had a camera crew in that service. You saw it briefly on that clip. And to see that people from all over the country, people like Reverend Tracy Blackman from Ferguson, Missouri, Cornell West, all these people, of all different races and backgrounds came together so they could stand up to these idiots.
Yeah. And you were talking to, I mean, you spoke to some of the people who had been marching with the torches, if I remember correctly.
I did.
What did they say to you?
I think they reflected a lot of the fear that some people in white America have about changing demographics in this country. It will be a minority-majority population in the U.S. in 2044, and for white working class people or for blue-collar jobs, that number is going to be a minority-majority 10 years earlier, so in 2032 about. And so I think there's a lot of fear about liberal policies. They would say, Jason Kessler, I interviewed him, these liberal policies, they're wiping out white America, that they need a homeland, that they're getting bred out, all these, insane things. Mm-hmm. And, but that I think are emblematic of this general fear among some members of the population that the America that they once knew is being destroyed.
Yeah. So as you comb the country collecting these stories, What was your sense of the Trump factor in terms of, did you see the Trump presidency as a cause or effect of what you witnessed?
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think it certainly has made us more divided. I think it is, as I said, kind of taken salt and really created a deeper chasm between people. But I also wanted to understand why people might have turned to Donald Trump. I know it's kind of become an old chestnut to go and talk to Trump voters, but I really wanted to go deeper than that and talk about shrinking American towns and cities, that where the economy has shifted dramatically. One company towns like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where Bethlehem Steel was so important for the economic vibrancy of the town, and what that has wrought, and people who saw generations of sure employment or certain employment evaporate with technology, automation mainly, more than globalization, the flight of young people from many of these cities to urban areas. And so one of the interesting things I did is I went to Fremont, Nebraska, and talked to some residents there about their fear of and disdain and really anger over immigration. And then I contrast it with a town called Storm Lake, Iowa, a very white state, but a very diverse town where it's already a minority population, where they see an immigrant population as really the reason that town is continuing to thrive. And I talked to this man named Art Cullen, who's the editor of the Storm Lake Times, Circulation 3000 or something. He's won a Pulitzer Prize, and he's just an amazing man who talked about the importance of welcoming immigrants and the fact that these towns that don't. I said, what would you say to them? He said, get a shovel and start digging, because you're going to have to you're going to bury yourselves if you close yourself off to these, immigrant populations.
Yeah. I don't know the exact timing of your reporting in these various places and when specifically you were talking to Trump supporters, how long he had been in office. But was your sense that people felt like he was delivering on his promises?
Well, like I went to Erie, Pennsylvania, and talked to 3 people who had worked for General Electric, had been laid off for about a year. And, the 3 guys were in their late 30s and mid 40s. I think most of them had voted for Obama twice. And I think they just felt that what they were doing, I think honestly it comes down very simply to the fact that Donald Trump came to Erie, he talked about jobs, he seemed to hear them, he seemed to be paying attention to them. They don't want to leave Erie, they have deep family roots and connections, which I think in some ways is laudable, right? And Joan Williams wrote a book, I highly recommend it to all of you, and it's very thin, so you can get through it quickly. It's called White Working Class, and it's based on an article she wrote for the Harvard Business Review shortly after the election, which basically really talks about some of the disenfranchised people who are really struggling in many towns and cities across America. And they see that, they consider themselves now a marginalized group who deserve at least some sympathy and some attention to the struggles that they're facing. Their deaths of despair that are claiming so many lives in these towns. Suicides, Erie's suicide rate is at an all-time high, and the average person who commits suicide is a 47-year-old white male. So their pain is real, their fear is real, and while we may not agree or people may not agree with where they are politically, I wanted to at least help people understand how they got to this point and how they could support someone like Donald Trump, who seems antithetical to what the values so many other people believe in and ascribe to.
I'm eager to see the episode on the effects of technology on our brains. I think about the issue a lot, the technology revolution of the last 25 years and how it's transformed our lives. In preparing for this talk, I came across a video of the Today Show, an episode from 1994, which was the year.
God. Yeah.
I'm sure people have brought this up. So
well, what's most upsetting about this clip is honestly my hair and my sweater. really not what I'm saying.
Yeah. So 1994 was the year I graduated from high school. I had the same haircut. The subject of the internet, if you guys haven't seen this, the subject of the internet comes up, and Katie and Brian Gumbel are very confused. You clearly knew more than Brian, but not much.
Not really.
Not
Not
much.
much.
There was one point where Gumbel just says, "What is the internet anyway?"
No, we don't even say that. We say,
he says, "Do you write to it like mail?"
I know. And I said, Allison, who was a writer on the Today Show, can you explain what internet is?
Yes.
I don't even say the internet.
Right, that's right, internet, yeah. Can you explain what internet is? Well, it's funny because that summer as I prepared to go to college, I remember having a similar conversation with somebody who was trying to explain email to me.
Yeah.
And I was like, I just don't get it. I don't understand how this email works. But obviously, it's incredible how far we've come since then.
Amazing.
Today, many of us are in the grips of the internet from the moment especially social media, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed. And it's so useful, but it's also so addicting. And my question is, in the process of reporting on that specific episode, what did you learn? I mean, I sometimes wonder, my main question is, are we better off 25 years later after this technology revolution?
Well, clearly it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, think about the social movements that have been galvanized largely because of the internet and social movements, and social media, rather. I think about, whether it's Black Lives Matter, or I think about Moms Demand Action, about gun violence, and being able to connect like-minded people. Well, sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, right? Mm-hmm. Because I'm sure some of the people who were in Charlottesville were connected via the internet and social media.
Absolutely.
But I think what I really wanted to take a look at is it making us lose our humanity? iPhones have been around for 10 years, just a decade, but they have revolutionized the way we live on a daily basis. And, so I went to California and I had my brain tested for anxiety and also for my inability to focus. So I learned a lot of things. Some things are like Captain Obvious that you all already know, but there's no such thing as multitasking. You cannot really focus your brain on two things simultaneously. The very existence and appearance of a phone within your line of vision actually it affects your ability to focus on a task at hand. I can't stand when people are in a meeting and they have their phones and they start looking at them. It's so insulting. There's even a word now, phubbing, which I guess means snubbing with your phone. When you're talking to someone and suddenly they start texting someone and you're like, hello. And so I kept seeing all around us how these phones were taking over our lives. Going to restaurants, you see couples both on their phones. Nothing is more depressing to me than that. I used to be so depressed. I used to say to my friends or to my late husband or now to my current husband, look, they're not talking to each other. Tell me we're never going to be like that. Are we going to always have something to talk about? And now they just are on their phones the whole time at dinner, at a nice restaurant.
Yeah.
I think it's so weird. But anyway, I learned that the part of your brain that really is responsible for creativity can't fire up unless you're not distracted, and that's why some of our most creative thoughts come to us in the shower or when we're taking a long walk untethered by technology. And I think one of the most upsetting things I've learned is, kids and technology. There's a huge word gap between children of means and children of poverty. I think it's 30 million words by the time they're 3 years old because of the interaction they have with adults talking to them about language. And now I worry that the gap is actually going to close. I mean, first of all, we need to increase vocabulary for children, underserved kids. But now you see so many mothers and fathers, they're not even playing with their kids at the playground. They're on their phones the whole time, or they're pushing a stroller and they're on their phones the entire time and not talking to their kids about the world around them or engaging them in any way. But the one thing, this one doctor I spoke to, who studies addiction, said the blue lights from our screens, it interrupts melatonin and increases cortisol, and that affects sleep. And the lack of sleep, they're starting to see plaque in the brains of children that is similar to the plaque that you get when you have Alzheimer's disease. So there's a big concern. It's very early in the research, so don't completely freak out. But it's worth noting, honestly, for all of us, you know, if you wake up in the middle of the night like I do all the time, and my husband now, I'm not allowed to have the phone in the bedroom anymore.
Yeah.
We just have Alexis, which is also creepy. Do you know that you have to tell her to stop listening if you don't want her to listen to your conversation? Did you know that?
No.
And you can ask her to tell dirty jokes and stuff, which is sort of funny too. She doesn't really tell dirty jokes, but you know, I think it's just transforming everything we do. And you know, you think about young women's suicide rates have increased dramatically. I think partially because the pressure. You have an 18-month-old, but you know, the pressure, which hopefully your 18-month-old is not on an iPhone yet.
No technology.
But do you have a little boy or a little girl? I can't remember.
A little girl.
So does she try to swipe the screen?
Yeah, well, I even feel conflicted about it in the morning when we're up and I have to check my phone for something, and she takes it from my hand and starts to navigate around it, and I remove it as quickly as possible. But it is one of the most stressful things that, for me, is wondering how to integrate technology into the life of a child.
And sometimes I think, am I just like, you know, Paul Lynde singing in Bye Bye Birdie, What's the Matter with Kids Today? But I know, I'm so glad that some of you got that reference. But other times I think, you know, wow, you know, as gee whiz and the bells and whistles and how it makes things convenient. We can Google things when we're having a debate about something. Well, let me Google that. You know, those things are wonderful, but I just think we need to step back and say, what is this doing to us?
So after this reporting on technology and really talking to experts and looking at the research of the effects, you've said that you and your husband now have a rule where you don't bring the phone into the bedroom.
And I do sleep much better, I have to say. Except I wake up in the middle of the night, I have no idea what time it is. I don't want to ask Alexis, is that her name, Alexa? Thank you, because I don't want to wake him up. Yeah. So then I have to like walk to the kitchen to see the light on the microwave.
Oh my goodness.
So it's really a pain. Or because if I go to my phone, then I'll start looking at it, and then I won't go back to sleep. I have a lot of problems.
Are there Are there any other changes that you've made in terms of how you interface with technology after learning everything that you did?
I mean, I want to and I plan to, but so far I really, other than not having the phone in the bedroom, I haven't done it a lot. I'm going to try, especially quality time with my girls, for example. You know, my 22-year-old daughter, it's ridiculous how much she's on that thing. And it's a huge difference between my 26-year-old and my 22-year-old.
Wow, even those 4 years.
Those 4 years, yeah, it's really crazy. So I'm really going to try to do things like if I go for a walk and I don't care about the app that tells me how many steps I've walked. I'm gonna leave it at home and just feel free. And you know, sometimes I'm watching a TV show like The Crown, which I loved, and I'm like looking at my phone. I'm like, I have no idea what just happened on that episode. I have to rewind it. So it's also it's such a time suck. Oh, yes. So I'm going to try to be much more mindful about it as soon as I'm done publicizing the series.
Yeah, fair enough.
And answering my Twitter and stuff.
So last fall, my reporting partner, Jody Cantor, and I broke the story of Harvey Weinstein and these decades of... Hey, thanks. Thanks, guys. And the decades of alleged sexual harassment, abuse, and rape of women. And we all know what happens next. In the following months, many men from many different industries were exposed for sexual misconduct in the workplace and ousted from their jobs. And among them was Matt Lauer, your longtime colleague. And I was wondering where you were when you heard about him and what your reaction was.
I was in California working on this series on gender inequality. And yeah, very ironic. And someone not knowing that I was in California woke me up at shortly after 4 a.m. to tell me. And like many people, I was really shocked, really, really upset. And It's taken me, and I don't think I'm there yet, honestly, many months to process this whole thing and to try to understand it and to try to, I still don't know all the details and the reasons why, I don't know all the details of what happened, really what I've read in the press. I've never had a conversation with Matt about it. And, you know, it was very, very upsetting. I had a really positive professional relationship with Matt for many years. He was always incredibly respectful to me. He's been a good friend to me. You know, when my husband died, he was a really supportive professional partner to me. And so you can imagine it was very discombobulating and disorienting. And I think it's taken a lot of us, at least in my generation, some time to process it and to understand and kind of appreciate a new way of looking at certain behaviors. I was unaware of all the, you know, or the people who had come forward that was happening. And I also think, you know, honestly, there's a zone of privacy that if you don't know what somebody's doing or their behavior, you know, and nobody is coming to you upset or complaining, you just kind of think people have different lives and people are doing different things and it's really none of your business. But it's made me kind of think about power, the dynamics of power, how they play out in a workplace. I was very fortunate in that I had a position of a lot of responsibility at a pretty early age. You know, I became the co-anchor of the Today Show at 34. And so even earlier in my career, I wasn't subjected to much harassment or inappropriate behavior. Yes, some, you know, and I can tell you about them, I'm happy to, but none that really were devastating to me, and partially because I had a male ally helping me navigate it. But I think, you know, it's just made us reconsider sort of what is consensual and what is not consensual, and what does that mean, and how does this play out in a work environment, and how can we make work environments better? I think things just got, you know, sort of, there were no guidelines for so long, and people, if there was sexual harassment training, you know, sessions, at least where I worked, people would kind of roll their eyes and not take them seriously. And I think that there needs to be more leadership on every level in companies across the country, and very specific rules of engagement, if you will, for employees, you know, in terms of inter-office relationships, in terms of extramarital affairs, which I've witnessed my whole career, people, you know, having relationships despite the fact they're married with people who are less powerful than they are. I mean, it happens all the time with a lot of, you know, high-ranking individuals at many networks. So I think that we really have to take a closer look about, you know, if that, and that sets the tone, I think, of sort of anything goes in a way.
So you haven't had any communication with Matt?
I haven't.
Yeah.
I mean, we texted a little bit, and I hope to be able to talk to him. And you know, I'm trying to kind of gain a greater understanding about the perspective of some of the women who came forward about what that was like for them. Mm-hmm. So I'm still, as you can tell, kind of trying to get a handle on the situation. Mm-hmm. I don't think Matt is Harvey Weinstein.
No, I don't think he is.
And I think that he's paid a very high price for his behavior, and I think that behavior should not be tolerated. So that's sort of where I come down on it.
And do you think that there should be we were talking about this backstage in terms of, you know, what, there have been so many men who have been ousted from their jobs, and for allegations that range in severity from rape to groping to other inappropriate behavior. And my question is, do you think that there should be a path back into the workplace for men who have been ousted from their jobs?
I think it depends on the transgression and depends on sort of the level of I think if there's an epiphany or some kind of realization of damage that has been done, I think we all have to sort of talk about it together, and I think understand that there are different levels of transgressions, and so it's hard to say in a blanket way, is there a path back? I just don't know. I think it really depends on the individual, and I think it also depends on our ability as a society to have more conversations about this that include men and that include people who, I just think we should all talk about it some more. I think with many of these movements, the pendulum sort of swings pretty far. And my fear is that it's going to stop swinging altogether. But I think we have to get to a place where there's transparency at these businesses and corporations, and we have to come up with clear-cut solutions that will really tackle things like implicit bias, which is really the foundation of many of these problems with male-female equality in the workplace and beyond. And that we put more women in real leadership positions, not kind of fake leadership positions where they have decision-making authority. And I think that can tamp down a hyper-masculine work culture. So there are a lot of things. The Rooney Rule, one of my hours is on this. So I've really been talking to gender experts at Stanford and reading a lot of the literature about organizations who believe themselves to be meritocratic or the least meritocratic. And the Rooney Rule, which was named for Dan Rudy, the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, which says for every job opening in coaching and management positions, a minority candidate needs to be interviewed. And as someone in Silicon Valley said, how can we hire people if we don't even know them? They're not obligated to hire them, but they're obligated to interview individuals, which will open things up. So I think things are changing dramatically, but we have to kind of not take our foot off the pedal, I think.
So I think you're right that there do need to be more women in real positions of power. You've been a woman in real positions of power going back many years and have had, and I was reviewing your portfolio when preparing for this interview, and it's really remarkable all the different interviews you've done and the reporting and experiences that you've had in journalism. And I was wondering, I had forgotten about the Sarah Palin interview, which was sensational.
She hasn't.
What was it like to do that interview?
That was sort of the third network interview she had done. She had done something with Charlie Gibson, and then I think she did something with Sean Hannity. That was, I'm sure, a really tough interview. And then she came to me, and honestly, I really tried to ask questions that would indicate accumulated knowledge and the ability to be a critical thinker and an understanding of public policy. Because after all, the Vice President of the United States should have a basic understanding of public policy, right?
You would think so.
I felt for her, I did, because I really think, and I think it's sad in a way, because I think she could have been quite a force in politics. Maybe not the kind of force a lot of people would agree with, but at least if she had, I think, gone and really done her homework and really understood a lot of these critically important issues. I don't think I could have answered a lot of the questions I asked well, but I wasn't running for vice president, and I wasn't going to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. And at the time, John McCain had melanoma 4 times, and the possibility that something might have happened to him. And of course, we all wish him really well with his current medical struggles, but that was a very real possibility. So I felt bad for her because, as a person, to see someone struggling, someone in Time said it was like a 7th grader trying to do their oral exams, but that was insulting to 7th graders and oral exams.
Yeah.
So I did as a person. And I remember I talked to a lot of people from all political persuasions in preparing for the interview, because she had kind of burst onto the scene at the convention and was like, and at the time, Obama was kind of flatlining, right? And she just kind of came out of the gates like gangbusters. And I remember Madeleine Albright said, just let her talk. And I thought, you know, because I think we all have this impulse, especially if there's an uncomfortable silence, to fill it.
Sure.
And to kind of step in and kind of help somebody. And so I remember that I was going to ask a question, and then I wasn't going to interrupt her, and I was going to let her continue to talk. And I also remember that I wanted to be, you know, just very have an almost Parkinsonian affect in my face. My dad had Parkinson's, so I hope that's not an insult to people who have Parkinson's. But, you know, that basically expressionless. And because I knew that even back then in 2008, the country was starting to become very divided, and that people would then attack me for gotcha questions, which they weren't. Like, what magazines and newspapers do you read to help establish your worldview? It's not a gotcha question. To me, it's a question about how have you become, you know, how have you started to hold the positions you hold, and what shaped them? You know, she should have said, I read newspaper, every Alaskan newspaper, because that's my first priority. And I like to read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal editorial pages to get different perspectives, and Field and Stream and whatever. But she, you know, and I was like, let me tell you how to answer that question. But she, I think, was so aggravated with me at the time, she sort of lost her cool and started saying that I thought people in Alaska don't read, and I think people in Alaska read.
Yeah, yeah. What happened when the cameras turned off? What was your interaction like once the interview was over?
She was perfectly cordial, and I think my friend Brian Goldsmith, who helped kind of, we spent many days writing these questions, and kind of, she'd been at the UN, so we had an international session, and then I went to Ohio, where she was speaking to talk more about domestic issues, which I can't believe they agreed to do that second interview. And that's where the question that got so much attention about what do you read sort of happened. But I remember he said that one of the press aides, he read his BlackBerry, and it said, "This is a disaster." So we kind of knew, I didn't really know that it would be impactful, but I think there were a lot of people who maybe weren't comfortable with Barack Obama at the time because maybe they thought he didn't have enough experience. We're kind of gravitating toward John McCain. And I think there was this big swath of undecided voters that maybe, I don't know how influential or how much influence that interview had, but might have seen it and said, maybe not.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So what were some of the other interviews over the years that really stand out in your memory?
Gosh, I mean, I've really done so many.
You've done so many. You've done so many. But if you had to say the other, say, you know, another two that really.
Well, early in my career, I was interviewing Barbara Bush about the anniversary of the White House, and I had studied so hard about the Dolly Madison tea set. Like, I knew everything that was in the White House on this. We were going to go on a tour, so much so that I ended up telling Barbara Bush about a lot of things that were in the White House, which was not the point of the tour. But President Bush came in sort of unexpectedly, and I had to kind of grab him and talk about Iran-Contra and about Bill Clinton. And I mean, I had to do it really fly by the seat of my pants. And it was intense and insane. And his lip was kind of going like this. President Bush is really, I think, a wonderful person, but he was really quite sorry he walked in there that day. And
what was one of the hardest hitting? I mean, what did you get him? What made him so nervous?
I think I was talking to him a lot about Iran-Contra.
Okay.
Frankly, I have to probably go and rewatch that interview because. But I think that that made him, I think he thought I was just going to be like, hey, how are you? Let's talk about the ball and club, is what they're called, the feet on those chairs. Let's talk about the Chippendale chairs or whatever. And so that was funny. And I remember Marlon Fitzwater coming in to try to kind of wrap things up. And I said, Marlon is pulling out what's left of his hair.
Oh my goodness.
And they laughed about that. Anyway, so that was sort of early in my career. And that was kind of an exciting moment that required a lot of kind of instantaneous, just, you know.
Right, you had prepared to interview her.
Yes.
And here you are.
Yes, suddenly talking about
getting an interview with the president of the United States.
Yeah, exactly, completely unexpectedly. I just didn't think he was going to come in. And I think the other one that I've sometimes mentioned is in the days after Columbine. I went immediately to Littleton, Colorado, and the Today Show booker, Jen Brown, who's a dear friend of mine, was able to get Michael Scholes, who had lost his son Isaiah Scholes, and a young man named Craig Scott, whose sister Rachel had been killed. And it was the next day. And it was, I think partially it's so memorable for me and so poignant because it was very early, pitch dark, and it was snowing in April. And they came and they sat next to each other, and you know, you can't imagine obviously what that is like. And their anguish was so raw. And I thought they were so unbelievably courageous to come and sit next to me and share what is the worst possible thing that could happen to anyone. You know, losing a sister and losing a son in this senseless, completely unexpected way. And it was really less that I was interviewing them than I was witnessing a certain kind of grace. Right. And it was also very poignant because Michael Scholes was this big, burly African-American guy, and I think he had a Dallas Cowboys jacket on, and Craig was this broken, kind of blonde young man, and they, you know, held hands, and it was just a really, it was almost like a spiritual experience for me to witness it. Yeah. So I always think of that as well. Yeah.
Well, that is the end of our interview portion of
Sorry,
this.
I'm ending on a sad note.
No, it's very touching. And we're actually now going to take questions from the audience. Oh. So if people could look for the microphones in the aisles, we're going to go one at a time here. I see some, right, that's one.
Hi, Katie.
Hi.
My name is Jonathan. I'm a teacher. Not funny, but coincidentally that you mentioned Columbine, because 20 years ago I was part of a panel of teens that you interviewed about Columbine on Dateline NBC. And 20 years later, you know, school shootings are still very prevalent in our society. As a teacher, I have to practice on the regular basis lockdown drills with my students. And I remember at the time the questions you asked us were a lot about teen bullying and conformity. 20 years later, how do you think the narrative has changed? What are your thoughts on that? Because 20 years later,
good question. Good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, how the conversation has shifted. I mean, I still think there is an issue with isolation and certain kids being ostracized and cruelty and bullying in schools that I hope teachers and administrators and students themselves have become more aware of the need to not marginalize students or mock them, and you know, the kinds of things that happen all the time. But I think obviously the debate, and I did a documentary about this, has really turned to the easy access of guns and how we can make our community safer by just some very sensible gun laws that still, for whatever reason, you know, I went to Newtown to Sandy Hook after that happened and interviewed the Bardens. They invited me into their home, you know, after Daniel, their son, had been murdered. And it just was shocking to me that they could not even pass legislation after those young first, second graders had been, I mean, it's just unbelievable. Mark told me they couldn't even go to identify Daniel's body because they wouldn't be able to recognize him. And, I think that I'm so inspired. I know I'm not alone. I'm so inspired by the kids at Parkland because, Mark and I were talking about it because we were saying, you have to have a built-in advocacy base of people who collectively join forces. That's why I think you've seen so much research in breast cancer, because there's so many survivors. And my sister died of pancreatic cancer, and there are very few survivors to form this advocacy base. And I think these kids are really remarkable, and they're all smart and on the debate team and can get sponsors to leave Laura Ingram's show. I mean, they're really amazing. Yeah. And they're using, I think, their voices. So I think clearly, I think that's been the biggest change, although that was certainly something we talked about during Columbine as well. Yeah. And these ridiculous automatic and semi-automatic weapons. My favorite sign at the March for Our Lives was, my life is more important than your hobby.
Yeah. How about
like
over
that?
here?
Hi.
Hey, Katie. I grew up watching you every single morning because my mom is a huge fan. So.
Aw, thanks.
It's good
That
to see
always
you.
makes me feel so old, but thank you.
Oh, you look good. You look great. So I wanted to say I wrote a song called Detox from My Phone, and we spent 24 hours in New York City without a phone, and we wrote a little short film about it.
Oh,
what do you
wow.
think us young people could do about the cell phone crisis? Like, it's really a problem.
Well, what do you think? You did it.
What I think that we have to start actually taking time to put the phones away and do it for a period of time just to like reconnect with people actually. Yeah, so
I agree
maybe
with
you
you.
could start a movement or something like
Yeah,
that.
well, there should be like National Disconnect Day. There
Yeah,
are days
something
for
like that.
everything else.
Yeah.
Pizza Day, sibling day. So maybe we should do that.
Yeah,
But I
that'd be
think,
great.
there's a method, there's a reason that we're all so addicted, and that is because there are all these engineers in this attention economy who are trying to figure out ways to make it so attractive. Someone showed me how you can take your phone and turn it into black and white instead of all these colorful, appealing icons. So I did that for about 15 minutes. I couldn't stand it. And I was like, I miss the colors on my phone. But all of this produces dopamine, all this reinforcement. It's really sad. We're just really, I think, creating a whole generation of narcissists who all they care about is positive reinforcement from the outside. I can't even tell you how many times I check my Instagram account. It's pathetic. Yeah, it's really pathetic. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? And I think it also is hurting people's inabilities to develop healthy self-esteem from within and saying you don't need positive reinforcement. And what does that say about our ability to be nonconformists and to kind of think for ourselves when we're just so dependent on what other people are saying and liking and approving? It's really, really weird.
Yeah. How about
I'd
you,
like
sir?
to see your film, though.
Yeah,
All right, thank you. It's on YouTube.
Yeah,
Okay.
all right.
What's it called?
Detox
from my phone.
All right.
And it's a song, too? Yeah. All right.
All right.
To make you feel a little bit better, I was born during the Truman administration.
Thank God.
I've seen you before, and I always enjoy it dramatically, your insights and your knowledge into all of these subjects. I've been around, as I said, quite a while, and Trump is now doing things, it's not just policy issues that we've had in past administrations. Most educated people, and you've been in Trump land, I don't know what their attitudes are, but his attacking the Justice Department and individuals in the FBI and so on, and his whole attack on democracy and what he's doing, where do you see people like Mitch McConnell? He's not a youngster. I mean, his job can't be that important that to grab Trump's base, he's willing to allow the United States to just be in a position it's never been. I as an older man, I really feel, and I have children, grandchildren, I'm very worried that democracy is on its way out. And it's having, when Trump speaks, he speaks to the world. So it's having an impact everywhere, in Hungary and France, and it's. So I'm very curious what your opinion is to how we're going to solve this, sir.
I know what you mean. I mean,
30 seconds, Katie. 30 seconds.
Let me rephrase it. You can't answer how we're going to solve it, but you've probably known people like Mitch McConnell for a long, long time. The George Bushes, as you mentioned, where are they?
Well, I think, you saw Mitt Romney speak out very vociferously against Trump during the campaign. I think, it is very disconcerting that we're not hearing more voices of outrage from Republicans, for example, on Capitol Hill, like Paul Ryan and people like that. And I don't know, I kind of think, call me a cockeyed optimist, but I kind of think that we can only handle the weight of this for so long, and that fair-minded people from all political persuasions at some point are going to say, enough, we can't live in a society where our democracy is being so threatened and the behavior of the leader of our country is so repugnant. So I do think that something's got to give, as the Frank Sinatra song says, and that something will happen. But it's a very anxiety-producing and worrisome time. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, and really it's affecting my physical health.
I think maybe it's why I get up at 4:30 in the morning. Yeah. I don't know. I think there's a lot of anxiety in the country, and I don't think it's healthy.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Hello. I grew up in New Zealand, so I never got your show. So I actually only know you from your podcast with Brian, which I love. So I'm wondering, how have you found it transitioning between, being on TV and then being on a podcast? What has that experience been like for you?
Well, thank you for listening to the podcast, everyone. I have a podcast. The podcast has been really gratifying for me professionally. I think, as you know, as attention spans get shorter, if you watch television today, even news networks, there's very little time to talk in any substantive way about important issues. And I think as the landscape has become increasingly fragmented, there's a fear of tackling too many intelligent issues, or thorny issues for fear of alienating certain members of the audience. And so for me to be able to spend 45 minutes talking to Brian Stevenson about the opening of his museum that will talk about lynching in the South, and to be able to talk to him about mass incarceration and all kinds of things, it's such a privilege and a treat. So I also, so I'm able to have these in-depth conversations, and I think people are hungry for them. That's why I was saying to Megan, it's so great that the Times, not to blow smoke up the Times, but that they host these events where you can actually hear from people in ways that aren't just a soundbite. So I've really enjoyed this podcast format. And my 22-year-old daughter, it's interesting to me, she listens to podcasts. She listens to The Daily. I know they're coming on next. And so I think what's also gratifying is that there's a hunger for that. And I don't have to wear any makeup when I do them, which is the best part of all. So thanks for listening.
Yeah. How about over here?
I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania.
Oh, hey.
And I might have gone to school with the mother or grandmother of one of the 3 young men you interviewed. And you weren't very specific when you were talking about it just now, but I assume those 3 young men were white. And you talked about how they were impressed because Trump came and talked to them. So my question is, do you have any, is there a possibility that you may go back a year from now or whatever and talk to those same young men if they don't become part of that terrible statistic that you mentioned, and see how they've changed?
That's a great idea. I would like to. I'd like to stay in touch with them. I went there in November, and I would love to see. I think they felt it was too early to make a judgment about the promises that Trump has made towards a lot of these working class communities, to see if they still have faith in him as an individual, especially given all the things that are going on now that the previous questioner just mentioned. But I think that would be incredible. I just do want to tell you about a pretty profound experience I had when I did that one episode. I was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, because I was talking about a lot of the kids leaving these rural towns and going to big cities. And I was with some EMS workers because of the opioid crisis, and they sort of talking to them about how they've been able to manage that. And we were just sitting around having cold pizza, and I decided to just throw out some hot button cultural terms. So I said, how do you feel about Colin Kaepernick? And I knew that they would say that they thought it was ridiculous what he was doing, that he was raised by white parents, I think they said, and that they didn't understand it was so disrespectful. Then I said, what do you think of Black Lives Matter? And they said, predictably, I thought, all lives matter. And as if on cue, an African-American EMS worker walked in. And I said, Carlos, I just asked him, his name is Carlos, what your colleagues think of these two movements. And he was very measured, and he said, you know, I remember as a child looking at photos of men with my skin color being lynched. And if I looked at someone like you, Katie, a Caucasian woman, that could have happened to me just by looking at you. He said, Black Lives Matter to me is an extension of some of the things that, you know, African Americans have been fighting for, and you have to, I'm paraphrasing him, wonder if that amount of hate exists today. And that's what I think this movement illustrates, something along those lines. And his 4 coworkers said, wow, we actually are, that makes us think about it in a totally different way. And one of them said, you know, Carlos, we've never wanted to bring stuff like this up because we didn't want to make you uncomfortable. And it just showed me that 6 people sitting around a table actually kind of discussing some of these things and understanding them a little bit better. It was really kind of profound, honestly, to witness. And then you know, who knows, did they go back and start watching Fox News again? And then kind of forget everything they heard. But it made me realize the power of just a moment of people actually bringing up things that are uncomfortable and then listening and then kind of thinking about it. So it was really actually pretty cool.
And these are some of the people who are in an episode that's okay.
And the white anxiety episode.
Well, but
that's a good idea. I should go back.
Very good.
Maybe you can come with me.
I'd be delighted.
Well, and this is an incentive for all of us to keep watching this fabulous show as the episodes continue to roll out.
And really talk about it. You know, I really want to use it as a springboard for conversations, for tough conversations where people can get out of their echo chambers or comfort zones and really like hear other people without so much harsh judgment.
Well, speaking of conversations, we're going to have to wrap this one up.
Sorry, ladies.
sorry, guys. But it has been such a pleasure to talk to you about all these various issues. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was fun.